The video game Red Dead Redemption 2 has 8 chapters in it, all unique in their own ways with their own ups and downs. Some chapters are just alright, and some are absolutely amazing, but one thing that's always true is that each chapter has their own part to play in an overarching story of the Vanderlyn gang. Today, I want to rank each of these chapters to see which one is truly the best. Just a quick disclaimer, I will be ranking these chapters on several things, including how fun they are to play, how creative the missions in it are, and how good their story is, along with several other factors as well. The ranking of each of these chapters are purely my opinion, and they are objective, meaning if I say a chapter is the best, the majority of players might not necessarily agree with me. Anyways, it's time to build a little tier list together. First up, we have the very first chapter of the game. Now, this chapter isn't really like the other chapters, as it's more of a tutorial chapter for the player to teach them the basics. Now, the first time playing this chapter, it's absolutely amazing. It's really good at introducing the player to the world of Red Dead, along with Dutch's gang. It also introduces the main character who you play as in the game, Arthur Morgan himself. I think this chapter also does a good job at seamlessly blending tutorials with the actual missions you're completing, so it doesn't really feel like you're just sitting there reading instructions. It actually feels like you're playing the game. With that said, there are also some main flaws with Colter as well. One of the biggest problems in this chapter is that it gets really boring on any playthrough that isn't your first. The tutorials that felt so good the first time get old really quickly since you already know how to play the game. Another thing that sucks about this chapter is that you're not really meant to leave the mountains that your camp is in this chapter, since it's more of a tutorial. You're pretty much just stuck in one tiny area, completing mission after mission until you get to chapter 2. Now, like I said before, this is really good for a first time playthrough, since you're not really concerned with leaving the mountains, since you don't even know what the rest of the map looks like, plus you're also preoccupied with learning the game. But after the first playthrough though, you're kind of just trapped in a tutorial simulator until you finish the first chapter. With all that said, I do really like chapter 1, and I think it's amazing in your first time playing the game, but after that I think it gets really old super quickly in any other playthrough, making me want to put it at the bottom of B tier. Next up is one of mine and most of the community's favorite chapters, that being chapter 2. This chapter is practically perfect and does almost everything right. It has a great blend of gameplay and story, and although it does have a few tutorials at the beginning, most of them are over before you even finish a quarter of the missions in this chapter. A lot of my favorite missions from Red Dead 2 are in this chapter, whether it be hunting bears with Hosea or drinking in a bar with Lenny. You're also able to free roam as much as you please in this chapter, allowing you to explore every part of the map, that's accessible to Arthur at least. This chapter, and part of chapter 3, is the only time in the game where the entire gang is together, which is also really good. To be honest, the only problem I have with chapter 2 is that a lot of the guns and weapons are still locked because you have to complete missions later on in the game that unlock them, so you're stuck using mid-tier weapons until you can unlock better ones. Other than that though, this chapter is perfect and really embodies the togetherness of the gang better than any other chapter in the game, which is why it's going at the top of S tier. Now, chapter 3 is kind of all over the place. At the start of this chapter, the gang is all together and happy, but by the end, everyone's starting to get pissed off at each other. I think one thing this chapter suffers from a lot is filler missions. Some of the main missions could be removed from the game, and I feel like it wouldn't really impact the ending of chapter 3 in any way. One string of missions that I don't really like are the Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite missions, at least from a gameplay wise. They don't really have much to do with the story, and it seems like it should be an optional side quest story, but for whatever reason, they're mandatory missions, which I don't really get. Now, this wouldn't be that bad if the missions were fun to play, but a lot of them just aren't. They usually just consist of you being the errand boy, whether it's delivering a letter to someone or slowly driving a wagon around. This chapter, just like chapter 2, still has a great story for the most part, along with some very fun missions. This chapter is so close to being in S tier, but there are a few things that kind of just bring it away from it, so I'm going to leave it at the top of A tier. I feel like chapter 4 is one of the most underrated chapters in the entire game. People always hate on it because they're like, oh, this is when the gang starts to turn on each other, so this chapter sucks. But I personally think this chapter has a lot more similar to chapter 2 than people might think. I personally think that although story-wise, this chapter is a tiny bit worse than chapter 2, I think it has better gameplay for several different reasons, one of them being the difficulty. In Chapter 2, there aren't really any hard shootouts until the very end of the chapter, barring a few missions here and there, but there are quite a few in Chapter 4. Not even including the bank robbery mission at the end of the chapter, there are a lot of good shootouts in this chapter. My personal favorite is the trolley mission with Dutch and Lenny. I think this mission does a really good job progressing the story, and I find it really funny how easily Dutch was set up by Bronte. I also really like the music in this mission as well, and I think that the last little bit where Lenny throws the stick of dynamite and then Arthur shoots it using Deadeye in midair is also very epic. Overall, I think this chapter gets way too much hate for what's given to us, and I think it deserves to be an S tier. Chapter 5, also known as Guarma, is universally recognized to be one of the worst chapters in the game, but I kind of feel bad for it. Two major criticisms Guarma has is 1, Chapter 5 just feels way too short to be a whole chapter, and 2, Guarma just doesn't fit in with the rest of the game. The reason why I feel so bad for Guarma though, is because it was originally supposed to be a lot bigger than it actually showed up to be in the game. The devs actually confirmed that Guarma was supposed to be an entire town that you could explore, with a lot more missions than what appeared to be in the game, but due to unknown reasons, all of this was cut. It makes me sad to see this, because this chapter could have been so great and creative, but because of these cuts, all we have left is a shell of Guarma's former self. One good thing I will say about Guarma though, is I do think it does a really good job of showing Dutch's psychopathic behaviors, but other than that though, there really isn't that much left to compliment about it, gameplay or story-wise. Because of this, Guarma is going all the way down in D tier. Next up, we have Chapter 6, and this chapter gets a lot of hate for the same reasons as Chapter 4, but once again, I disagree with these criticisms. Most people dislike Chapter 6 because the game is in a really bad spot, making them really dislike the story, but I think Chapter 6 has one of the best story arcs in the entire game, at least for Good Honor Arthur. If you choose to have Good Honor, this entire chapter focuses on the redemption of Arthur and his slow realization that his entire life has been a lie. Arthur realizes that all the things told to him by Dutch about how they were doing the right thing was a lie. He realized that all these years, Dutch wasn't the great leader and good person that he seemed to be, and that he was just manipulating everyone in the gang for his own benefit. Arthur realizes there's just no saving the entire gang, and some of them are just too far gone, so he goes against Dutch's wishes and tries to save as many of his friends as possible. One thing I also really like about this chapter is the debt collector side mission that Arthur does with Strauss, and how if you choose to be honorable, you end up absolving the debts for the people and kicking Strauss out. The last mission in this chapter, which is called Red Dead Redemption, is Arthur's final hurrah as he tries to save John and anyone else he can. I think the Good Honor Save John ending really suits Arthur in the end of his story and is one of the saddest deaths in video game history. It's very poetic. For the story alone and Arthur's amazing character arc and development, it's going in A tier. Next up, we have the Epilogue Part 1, which starts with just like a full 360 from how Chapter 6 ended. At the end of Chapter 6, everyone's crying because the person we just played as for the entirety of the game up until this point just had a very tragic death, and before we have a second to process what happened, we just get pulled into the next chapter. While we're still crying over Arthur's death, we just get thrown into John and Abigail arguing over random stuff. Anyways, after the long cutscene and opening mission, we get to the place where we spend a good half of this chapter in, Pronghorn Ranch, hence the title of the chapter. I'm gonna be honest with you, this chapter honestly suffers from the same thing Chapter 1 suffers from. It's good the first time you play it, but then it just kind of feels like a movie and less of an actual game for like the first half of this chapter. It isn't really until the second half of this chapter where you actually start to do stuff. If anything, half of this chapter is more so of like a bridge between Chapter 6 and the rest of the epilogue, and less of its own chapter. The second half of the epilogue, though, is when things start to get really good. For the first half of the chapter, you were mainly just doing farm work, but eventually you get to raid a nearby competitor's farm, and John looks badass in this mission. This is the first time since the start of this chapter that you're able to use guns at all, and it feels so good to do so. The music in the background of this mission is also an absolute banger and sounds very epic as well. I also like how you meet up with Uncle and Charles during the end of this chapter, but the highlight is one of the last missions of this chapter. Of course, I'm talking about the house building mission. This is one of the most iconic missions in Red Dead 2 for several reasons. mainly being the song, which is an absolute banger. I also like how this mission also shows how John made his iconic cast from Red Dead 1 as well, which is really cool for fans of the first game. Anyways, this chapter is absolutely sucks for the first half, but is really good for the second half. So if we average the two halves together, this chapter would probably get B tier. Even if you didn't play Red Dead 1, you most likely agree that Epilogue Part 2 is one of the best chapters in the entire game. This chapter is such a good chapter for plenty of reasons. Obviously, one of the big ones is that it's a massive callback for Red Dead Redemption 1 fans. You get to play as John Marston again and freely roam around New Austin and West Elizabeth, which was something you couldn't do at all as Arthur unless you glitched the game. One gameplay thing I really liked about this chapter was the bounty hunting missions you do with Sadie, since they're a completely new type of mission for most players, unless you did some of the bounty hunting side missions as Arthur. Something that isn't really talked about that much during this chapter though, is the little side story that John has with his family, with him trying to rebuild it. If you pay attention during some of the dialogue, you can hear that in the 8-year gap between chapter 6 and 7, John kinda wasn't that good of a father or a husband. So I really like how he tries a lot through this chapter to try and improve at that. One thing I really liked from a story perspective in this chapter was the slow foreshadowing of Micah returning. During this chapter, Sadie and a few others would tell you that they heard from newspapers and other sources that Michael was rumored to be lurking around in the area, which I think is a great type of foreshadowing for the end of the chapter. Speaking of the end of the chapter, this is one of the best missions in video game history. There's just so much hype building up to the climax of this mission, being when you get to the top of the mountain. John looks so badass during the entirety of his rampage throughout the mountain, and it shows how good of a sharpshooter he is, as he's literally able to solo kill almost 100 men. The music in the background is also fantastic, and it does a really good job of fitting the mood of what's happening as you're just running around the entire mountain, just obliterating anyone in your path. The last little bit of the mission where you activate Deadeye and just lay in as many bullets as you can into Micah is also very satisfying. All in all, this chapter is absolutely amazing from a gameplay and story perspective, so it's getting an S tier. Thanks for watching, guys. It was really fun to go back and evaluate each chapter after playing the game to its entirety, since I've never really done that before. Also, I know some of you guys like the Garden Warfare 2 videos, but would you also be interested in seeing content like this? Let me know in the comments. Also, tell me if you guys agree or disagree with my ranking of each chapter. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. And as always, adios.